Six Siege is one of the most unique games in the first-person shooter genre because the gameplay is so different than a lot of FPSs out there. One minute you might be having one of the most exciting gunfights of all time while you're hilariously thinking that this thing is going on way longer than it probably should be possible. How on earth are neither of us dead yet? And other times you're just kinda sitting around waiting for something to happen. Anything to happen. And then there's the occasional time where you're running for your dear life because, for whatever reason, your teammate seems to have turned into an assassin and wants to use their one free team kill on you, and somewhere along the line you've caught on. There's a variety of different experiences you can run into when you play Rainbow Six Siege, and while I'm definitely not a great Rainbow Six Siege player, I've actually been heavily invested in this game all the way since it first released in 2015. And let me tell you, 2015 Rainbow Six was drastically different than what 2022 Rainbow Six looks like nowadays. Not only was the gameplay and the pacing and the operators so much different than how they are today, there was something uniquely charming about those early years of Rainbow Six Siege. Before it hit the mass popularity that it later would receive, before there was a jillion operators, that it can be really interesting looking back at the vanilla era of Rainbow Six Siege. Nowadays, I feel like a lot of Rainbow Six players are nostalgic for pretty much any era of Rainbow that was in the first 3 years of this game's release. And honestly, with new seasons, the game's meta has significantly changed with each iteration. And we will talk about each year and how they were different in what we'll call the glory years of Rainbow Six. Not to say the newer years aren't great, they're probably more balanced than those years that are so fondly looked back at. But I don't know, some of the chaos back in those early days were kind of a fun part of the charm that Rainbow Six had. So let's back things up and go all the way to the very beginning of Rainbow Six, 2014's gameplay demo where they showed off the concept of Rainbow Six Siege for the first time ever, and boy were things quite a bit different. Okay, so for context, when Rainbow Six Siege first came out, not a lot of people jumped on board with the game right away. I actually ended up randomly getting it on accident. It's a long story. But prior to Rainbow Six Siege, I did have a really big affinity for the types of tactical shooters where you have one life and you have to kind of move slowly and sneak around. Now, most of my experience, of course, was on Modern Warfare 2 Search and Destroy, but that was all the way back in 2009. In the gaming space specifically, if you're an Xbox player or a console player in general, and you didn't have access to games like CSGO, for a game like this, where you get to sneak around and plant bombs and stuff, Call of Duty kind of was the way that you would go. And for the most part, in 2009, you had Modern Warfare 2, that was awesome, and we had Black Ops and Modern Warfare 3. But by 2013, we were getting like Call of Duty Ghosts, followed by Call of Duty Advanced Warfare to get our Search and Destroy fix going. And then all of a sudden, Rainbow Six Siege is announced that's going to be this fleshed out take on a very familiar game type that just adds so much more. Now, the first alpha footage that they showed off where they were kind of just showing the concept of the game altogether, it's really interesting to look at, as at this time in development, there weren't even operators yet. They were just different classes that you would choose between, and honestly, it was interesting how there was like a shield operator in every class. Like, that was a very important role in Rainbow Six. Of course, nowadays, you'd never see players running around, especially on house, playing in this manner, but it did present the idea of how this game would work, and it did a really good job at selling this game to the specific audience that it was trying to cater to. There was some buzz generating around this game, specifically because of the fact it had the Rainbow Six moniker with it, which was already an established franchise, but after some closed and open alpha testing, Rainbow Six Siege launched in December of 2015 and definitely didn't have the most overwhelming number of sales on day one. But Rainbow Six Siege would also be taking on the approach of being one of the very first live service games on console, meaning that from day one, they intended to have this game constantly be something that changed over time. Something where every couple of months, something new would enter the game, like a map or a new operator that would disrupt the same old gameplay and constantly keep things feeling fresh and new. And as we all know, this ended up working out very well. But before we go too far into that, looking at the day one version of Rainbow Six Siege is of course very interesting. I mean, we have just these operators across the board, which is significantly less than we have nowadays. There were some very interesting things that a lot of us are fond of, like back in the day, Jaeger had a good old ACOG. Just ACOGs on defense were just very commonplace. Ashe was OP with no hitbox and a good old R4. The maps in original Rainbow Six Siege all had day, night, and afternoon variations that would just come up in random when you were playing the game. And boy oh boy was the lighting a little bit scuffed on some of the maps in the afternoon times whenever these windows would be opened up. It felt like we were ascending into some astral plane whenever those wooden panels would come off the windows. Still, nonetheless, this earliest stage of Rainbow Six Siege definitely set the stage for where the game would begin versus where it would end up going. In the earliest days, there weren't things like roaming operators. I mean, there was Pulse, and yeah, you could run around the map if you wanted to, but the core gameplay, the way you played this game right, was to reinforce the room, anchor in, and hold off the attackers when you're on defense. And when you're on attack, you wanted to work together with your team to find the best way to breach into the room and push and find a flank. Everything was new with Rainbow Six Siege, so obviously the experience level and the map familiarity were limited. So with this very first base year 0 season that existed, a lot of the gameplay was much slower paced, and a lot of the time was confined to just one individual room versus it being an entire map dynamic that is changing round to round. It's really cool to look back at gameplay and see what the gameplay style was like way back in year 1. People weren't as aggressive or willing to sprint around a wide flank because the result would be death a lot of the time. Also remember, this is still very early on in Rainbow Six Siege's life when people were still just now learning that you could fuse the hostage. So there was definitely this learning curve. A lot of people were playing Recruit also because that was the first character you had unlocked, and a lot of us, myself included, wanted to get really good at one character first before I ventured off to other operators. So I definitely put a lot of time into playing Recruit in these earliest days. Actually, one thing that I think is really interesting is that if you look back at old footage from Rainbow Six Siege, not only can you see how different the gameplay was in this earliest stage, and the little nuanced things like how the lighting looks different in a lot of the locations, or the drones look different, but I don't know if this sounds weird, but there's something about the footage of looking at Rainbow Six in the beginning that looks more cinematic, and in a weird sense, grittier and more realistic in a weird way of putting the word. It seems like over the years, they progressively refined a lot of the visuals to optimize the gameplay, which was the most important thing to do, but it is kind of refreshing looking back at this old footage just to see how it looked all the way back then compared to now. Also, I was reminded of this, that you literally back then could just get on your drone and scan enemies over and over and over and over again and just make your way to the top of the leaderboard. It was a strat. I did it. I was one of those people. Now, of course, back in the day, Rainbow Six did have a little bit of a rough launch. There were problems with hit detection, disconnection, there were server tick rate issues, and other various bugs that they had to address, and they would actually get patches out on a pretty regular basis all the way back when they first started. I love looking through old patch notes for a game like Rainbow Six that has such this long legacy of changes that have drastically affected the game over the years, and one of the first patches they did made me realize something about Rainbow Six Siege I never noticed in those first days, but in the first patch that they did just a month after the launch, they reduced the time to detect defenders outside of the map from 5 seconds to 2 seconds, which means for the first month of Rainbow Six Siege, you could just run outside of the map for 5 whole seconds before the other team was alerted of your presence, and that is absolutely wild to me considering how now it's practically instant. Also, Glaz's scope was like a deep dark red, which was crazy. This was way before they did the highlight stuff, and even from day one, team killing was a serious issue in Rainbow Six, and during the open beta that they had done in Rainbow Six, they realized that griefing and team killing was a serious issue. Apparently, towards the end of the open beta run, intentional team killing had risen as high as 7.8% of all games in Rainbow Six. They were trying to navigate having a system that determines whether or not a team kill is intentional or not, and back then you could vote to kick players, which would become an issue in its own right later on, but in this first patch they actually implemented an auto kick feature that would remove players who are intentionally team killing, something that wasn't there in that first month. We would see more improvements and tweaks changing up things and optimizing the game in the following following weeks, and the launch of Black Ice, which came in February of 2016, was a really big deal because for the first time ever, brand new operators were introduced to the game with Frost and Buck, the first DLC operators to be introduced into Rainbow Six. And I remember jumping on Rainbow Six after taking a little break, coming back and not really realizing there was new operators in the game because I was kind of lost, and immediately getting bear trapped by one of Frost's traps, which now meant for the first time ever you had to look out for two different types of traps when you were playing on attack, because Capcan also would insta-kill you back then with his Capcan traps before they reduced it to only doing a specific amount of health. Also, during the Black Ice season, Frost actually had a nitro cell, which later was replaced with barbed wire. After the first season, we would see season 2, which was Dustline, and Valkyrie and Blackbeard were added to the game. Valkyrie having those really cool cameras that were incredibly subtle, and oh boy was Blackbeard overpowered back when he came out. Nowadays, Blackbeard is considered probably one of the worst operators in Rainbow Six Siege. He is very rarely ever picked in competitive league play. His assault rifle isn't that great, and his DMR is kind of outclassed by any other DMR, and his shield only protects him for one hit. But back in season 2, this was a completely different story. When he came out, Blackbeard could take 10 to 15 bullets before his shield would break, which is completely over the top overpowered, and it's no surprise that this would be nerfed. Also, around this time, back in year 1, this was when Rainbow Six would put a new map out every season, which is something that they only did in year 1. So at this point, we had already gotten Yacht and we got Border, and all in that first year, we would get Favela, the original Favela, and Skyscraper as well. Season 3 was Skull Rain, which was interesting because this time around, it added the introduction of Caveira and Capitao, but Caveira specifically changed up the gameplay significantly because this was the first operator that completely overhauled the meta, where there was kind of a new playstyle dropped into the game in the form of roaming and also counter roaming. Caveira was pretty OP at her launch as well. Both of her guns were incredibly powerful, especially her pistol, which did eventually get nerfed down the road. Her silent step was really quiet as well. And honestly, Caveira was so popular when she came out. If you were a casual Rainbow Six player, you probably didn't even get to play Caveira at all during Skull Rain because there was always some 12-year-old kid in your lobby who had picked Caveira before you were able to get to pick your operator. And once again, yeah, Capitao also existed. Favela back then definitely was an interesting map. It was probably one of the more confusing maps, and it makes sense why it went through so many reworks over the years before they finally just scrapped it and built a new favela in Favela. But it was a cool map at its time for being announced. And then there was Season 4, Red Crow, which introduced Echo and also introduced Hibana. Both of these operators did do pretty significant changes to both how attack and defense played. Finally, Hibana added the ability for a second breacher who also didn't necessarily have to stand right at the door to open up charges, which made her a fan favorite, and also let Thatcher mains finally feel like they could rely on other teammates than hoping someone picked Thermite. Hibana's original design, or at least the portrait, was a little bit odd. Matter of fact, this was the case with a couple of operators over the years. We saw Twitch get a redesign pretty early on because Twitch looked like this originally, and then they switched that out. Fuse's portrait was also different at launch, but it was interesting that Hibana was introduced and then years later they changed the portrait right before her elite skin came out. Probably for the better, to be honest. Echo was really cool, but also incredibly annoying with how powerful the concussions from his yokai was, and that was something they would have to tweak and change out just because this character became more of a nuisance type character than an actual challenge type character. It kind of broke some things up. And then also during this time, we had this period between year 1 and year 2, and I remember wondering if Rainbow Six would get a year 2 because they just done a season pass. And that was kind of all that they had promised at the end of year 1, and live services wasn't really a thing in video games. Everyone was used to the Call of Duty cycle where they just kind of announced another Call of Duty the next year, and this was a different company, so we didn't know what to think. We were optimistic and relieved when they did announce that the game would be continued for support through the next year and onward. But in the meantime, before Season 2 would start, they had this brilliant idea, hey, why don't we put Bartlett University from the Situations in the game and just throw some points on there, and boom, new matchmaking map that people can play on. Yeah, they ended up doing that, and this, to this day, was probably one of the worst maps that was ever put into Rainbow Six. Don't get me wrong, I'm just speaking objectively here. I personally loved Bartlett University as a map. I don't really understand the layout, and it didn't really make too much sense to me, but I had fun in the setting itself. I liked the atmosphere, I liked the set pieces, I guess. But man, I do remember playing ranked on this map and losing a lot of games. So maybe it just wasn't that good competitively, and it wouldn't be too long before this map was removed altogether from any type of matchmaking rotation. And moving into year 2, they also were starting to make considerations as what type of maps will be in the actual ranked rotation, and kind of switch up the casual and ranked gameplay even more, having ranked gameplay have a smaller map selection. But before this kind of came into full swing, we actually got to see 2 maps taken out of the game altogether through year 2, which was Favela and Yacht. They were removed completely from all map rotation. I think it was mostly because of some game-breaking bugs, but later on they were brought back by the time year 3 rolled around and put back into the casual playlist of Rainbow Six. Year 2 was a really big year for Rainbow Six as well, because this was the time where Rainbow Six started to gain bigger popularity beyond just the launch and the seasonal releases. It was starting to make waves in other countries, and also people started hearing about this game that was being supported for a long time that was actually getting better as time progressed, and people trying the game out at the beginning would also be willing to come back just to see what was new in the game, as there was a consistent flow of new content coming into the game. So season 1 of year 2 kicked off with Velvet Shell and introduced Mira and Jackal. Jackal was pretty much a direct response to how the game had shifted so dramatically with the introduction of a roaming character. They pretty much made a character for the sake of counter roaming. And then they introduced Mira, who would be a new anchor operator who could also defend the room from distance by having these black mirror shields. Season 2 of year 2 though was a little bit different from anything we had seen, because Ubisoft announced that they would be delaying the content for season 2, actually straight up canceling the new multiplayer map, which honestly was somewhat okay, because in Velvet Shell we got Coastline, which to this day is one of the better Rainbow Six maps. And then they also announced they would be releasing the 2 operators that were set to appear in season 2 in season 3 and 4, so the last 2 seasons of Rainbow Six would have 3 operators released instead of the typical 2. And instead of doing content, they announced Operation Health, which was a newly planned break where all of the developers would be able to stop working on upcoming content for a short amount of time and work on diving back into the game and fixing things up and optimizing the performance of Rainbow Six and overall health of the game, so that the future of Rainbow Six could easily be managed moving forward. I remember playing it during this time, and it was quite a bit of a lull having to wait all the way from when this year had first kicked off with the new operators in the map through the end of that season, through Operation Health, before finally getting new operators. But it seems like a lot of the fixes and tweaks that they did in that second year were really important. Finally, the windows weren't just completely blinding our eyes every time we looked around. There were a lot of memes though after Operation Health finished up where weird server issues would be joked about, where people were like, yeah, Operation Health totally fixed everything, but it actually in the long term probably did fix a lot of things, even if they weren't noticeable right away. In season 3, we would see the introduction of Legion and Ying, and also Ella was introduced, who was apparently supposed to release in that season 2 that never happened. Legion and Ying, they were cool and all. They were definitely overshadowed by Ella, because Ella's gun was so overpowered back then. It was one of the fastest fire rates in all of Rainbow Six. It had close to no recoil, plus Ella was fast and could maneuver around the map at speeds like Caveira, and for a long while Ella became one of the top picked Rainbow Six operators in both casual and competitive play, and Ubisoft had to put multiple different nerfs into Ella just to try to pull this operator back from being a must pick operator in every single round. And even to this day, despite the fact that they reduced the magazine size, they increased the recoil, they still are making tweaks to try to get people to lay off playing as Ella, because her pick rate and power rate is still a little bit higher than where Rainbow Six and Ubisoft would want this operator to be today. Then in the final season of year 2, we saw Operation White Noise, which saw the introduction of Dokkaebi and the introduction of Vigil. Dokkaebi being kind of one of the first counter-intelligent operators, which was interesting, and Vigil adding another roaming type operator to the lineup of roamers slash counter roamers. And Zofia, Ella's sister, was also added in here as well. And essentially, she was kind of like a better Ash that was just a little bit slower and actually had a hitbox. But this was a big deal because after the theme park map had released, which wasn't too popular just because the lighting was weird and the map was a bit confusing, Tower was a map that fans were incredibly excited about just because, I mean, look at this. This looks really cool. Gameplay-wise, maybe didn't have the best flow, having the operators have to push in from the rooftops and come down through only a select area without really having a way to peek in to the actual objectives as easily. But aesthetically, this map was pretty awesome. By the time year 3 rolled around, things were really looking bigger and brighter for Rainbow Six moving forward, though you could tell that in just the pipeline, producing this amount of content, trying to do 4 maps a year, along with 8 operators, probably wasn't something that would be viable in the long term. So it was around this time where Ubisoft announced that they would be considering doing map reworks to bring older maps up to speed instead of new maps, and events instead of also doing new maps. They really just wanted to try to get out of having to constantly put out new maps. So at the beginning of year 3, we had Operation Chimera, which introduced Lion, which at the time was so overpowered, it was pretty much just legal wall hacks where you could just see through walls. And they had to do some pretty immediate nerfs to try to patch up how way overpowered Lion ended up being. He just overshadowed everything. And then there was Finka, who was, for the first time ever, an attacking healer, though the way her ability worked early on really wasn't all that useful because it would just decharge fast and it just didn't really have all that much of a use. So Finka wasn't that popular until more recently in Rainbow after they've buffed her quite a bit. But yeah, Lion, he definitely had those hacks. Operation Chimera was really interesting because they added this infection type mode, which essentially was just a test demo to see if a game like Rainbow Six Extraction would be popular with fans and how it could play. And they essentially split off a team right after that to start developing that game. But hey, it was cool to see a little event and see operators come to life in a CGI trailer and just kind of see the universe of Rainbow Six expanded upon a little bit more. The next season, though, was Parabellum, which introduced Maestro and Alibi. Maestro, who had a machine gun on defense, because why not, along with cameras that could shoot people, and Alibi, who had holograms on defense, because why not. And we saw the map Villa introduced, which did look very cool, but also marked a big turning point for Rainbow Six moving forward, where Villa was the very first map that had a set time of day. It's probably like the afternoon or something, but it did not have a day or night version like all of the other maps in Rainbow Six, kind of foreshadowing that eventually these day-night variations would maybe be going away in the future. Operation Grim Sky would be next, which would be a rework of the map Hereford Base, essentially inspiring to completely overhaul the map and make it unrecognizable from what it used to look like. Yeah, I remember Grim Sky coming to Rainbow Six and then completely overhauling Hereford Base, which already wasn't a map in ranked rotation, and it was cool to have a new looking map that was obviously reworked from an original, but the more you played on the map, the more you kind of felt like you were losing something in the process of getting this new version of the map. The old Hereford Base kind of had this Kill House vibe, inspired from the older Rainbow Six games, and this new one just felt odd. It was just this stone building. I don't know. Maybe I'm alone in this, but I just didn't really care for the way that they reworked Hereford Base. And then they also introduced Maverick, a third hard breacher technically, who could just burn little peek holes through reinforced walls, and Clash, who was a shield defensive operator who, when introduced, literally was so broken with just all of these glitches that came with this operator that this operator had to be banned out of any matchmaking rotation for a significantly long amount of time while they tried to figure out how to fix this operator. There was a glitch where you could go under the map or something, and then there was an invincibility glitch, and they would bring the operator back and then realize there was another glitch and have to take the operator out of rotation again. There was some serious issues with Clash. She had a really rough time when this game first came out, and I think they had to end up overhauling a bunch of stuff before they were able to finally get Clash in the game consistently where the whole entire game wouldn't fall apart because of some uneven balancing thing. It also was right around this point where you definitely could start to feel the shift in the Rainbow Six core gameplay. Now, this still was the same game that we've been playing for years, but with the newer operators and these maps getting refined and tightened up for more competitive play, which was moving faster and faster than ever before, the game that Rainbow Six once was during those earliest days definitely was no longer present towards the end of year 3. Not that Rainbow Six where it was then or where it was going in the following years was a bad thing, but there definitely was something about those first 3 or so years where it was slower paced and everything was just learning how to play the game rather than learning the optimum strategies or tricks way back in the very beginning. Hereford Base getting overhauled, the first map that you encountered in your situation, which may have been your first thing you did in Rainbow Six, kind of marked a turning point, personally, in that this was kind of the beginning of a new era of Rainbow Six, one that was much different from what it once was, and one that was moving very quickly and likely would never slow down. Later on that season, we would see Operation Wind Bastion, which added operators like Kaid and Nomad, one of which kind of, at the time, outdid the existence of Bandit altogether, until later balancing and tweaks were made. And I don't know, I always got frustrated whenever Nomad just wind torpedoed me across the map. I did like the map Fortress, though this map never actually ended up catching on and being put into regular ranked rotation in the following years and seasons. And at this point, Rainbow Six was definitely a different game than what it was when it first launched. It really was kind of a Rainbow Six Siege 2, even though it's very unlikely they'll ever actually do a Rainbow Six Siege 2. Back right around this point, going into year 4, that's kind of where the game started to feel, just with having a large cast of operators added to the game, nearly eclipsing the amount of operators originally put in the game at launch, and there were more big things to come. The next year, of course, we would see other operators added, like Gridlock and Mozzie, and Outback would be the last new map added to Rainbow Six for a very long time, actually all the way until the season that we're about to enter at the time of recording this video. Other than that, it had been reworks and reducing the amount of operators introduced each season so that each introduction could be more refined and not run into a clash issue ever again. Don't get me wrong, I definitely still enjoy playing Rainbow Six. More recently, actually, I and some of my friends have been able to get into the game and put quite a bit of time into playing Rainbow Six. But if you're going to play in competitive, ranked, or even unranked, you're going to notice this game is quite different nowadays than what it once was. And that's fine, but it does still make me nostalgic for the old vanilla days of Rainbow Six, when you could just jump on and randomly have a teammate fuse a hostage. Now hostage isn't even in unranked or ranked, it's only in quick play. Or you could go and run around on Presidential Plane like an idiot. You have to roll the dice nowadays and hope you get it in quick play if you're going to even play Presidential Plane. It's sad to see some iconic things like House be reworked into a house that is quite unrecognizable. I've never seen a house that has this many hallways in it in the backside of the house. And if you look at Rainbow Six Siege now and you're like, yeah, this is what it's turned into. This is kind of the sequel to that original Rainbow Six game. I'm all for it. I think it has had a great progression and things are probably in better shape than they were back in the day, but it doesn't change the fact that I liked the chaotic quirkiness of those first few years of Rainbow Six Siege. Now, every once in a while, they do a special event called a Legacy playlist or something, and essentially you can only play as the original operators that launched in the game, and they give certain things back to operators like ACOG to Jaeger and an ACOG to Ash, which is something really cool. And you can even go and play on original House and original Hereford Base and Plane, because they know that that's the map that everyone really wants to play. And moving forward into year 7 of Rainbow Six, which is crazy to think about, they are saying that they're going to start doing these events on a weekly rotation, so it is possible the Legacy type event will get thrown into rotation sooner than later, and that might be a great way for older players like us who remember the good old days of Rainbow Six, back when Blackbeard could take 800 damage to his shield and walk away just fine. It'd be cool to see more expansions on those types of playlists. I miss playing as Recruit in Ranked and just, you know, having a winning game or a losing game and just have the whole team switch to Recruit and just hope for the best. Those types of memes were really special, and it'd be really cool if someday they'll acknowledge those types of things that are part of Rainbow Six's history. Still to this day, I think it's awesome that I can go in and play a ranked match and still get a map like Bank, which had been there pretty much from the beginning and is mostly unchanged from how it was, and be like, oh yeah, I remember playing on this map all of those years ago. And still, it's weird being nostalgic over a game called Rainbow Six Siege, but in a way, it's starting to set in, even if it's only been 7 years since this game has come out. But I don't know, maybe I'm alone on this. I'd love to know what your guys' thoughts are are on Rainbow Six Siege, so let us know in the comments down below. Also, make sure you subscribe with notifications on if you enjoyed this video. It helps us out a lot, especially because we're trying to do other content beyond just the Halo stuff we've been talking about, so that would definitely help us out a lot. And once again, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys all next time with a brand new video.